Hi guys, I'm going to go over the impact of commercialization or commercialism in physical education in sport. I'm looking at the A-level PE paper 2 for Edexcel, looking at the social aspects part of the paper. So commercialization, the key thing we need to remember is the golden triangle, and these types of questions often are 15 markers. However, if you approach it and revise it as a 15 marker, any little questions that might come up, you will have knowledge of. So do start your knowledge and understanding of, make sure you understand the golden triangle and the interdependence between these three aspects. So you've got business and sponsorship, interdependently working with sport, how they impact on one another, how sport and media impact with one another, how business and media interact with one another. Now, I'm not going to really spend much time talking about the different examples of how it works and how they go together, but you just make sure you understand and can just talk about the golden triangle. I'll refer to it a little bit, but we'll break it down into the types of how the questions are answered. So the first sort of area we're going to focus on is the viewpoint and sort of historical terms, and there's an important aspect to consider with this, which I'll get into in a minute, but it's linked from one of the examiner's reports. Then we'll go into the Olympic Games and commercialization, and then generally the positives and negative impact of commercialization. So going to what I said you need to be watching out for, there was an examiner's report that refers to students often citing the Olympic Games as the birthplace of commercialization. Now, the Olympic Games was really important in the impact on commercialization, and I'll get into that. But the earliest point of commercialization really is the early sort of industrial revolution periods where we get sport becoming commercialized, the starts of professionalism. So let's start with some of the key terms that you might need to know. Now, these come up as a short answer questions, as defining, for example, what is a gentleman amateur, or defining what a playing professional is, or defining what broken time payments are. However, if it was a 15-mark exam question and you wanted to sort of analyze and say that commercialization started around about the Industrial Revolution, then you will gain marks for that as well. So it's important to understand it. So the gentleman amateur, just defining it, you need to understand that basically gentleman amateurs were rich men usually who did not need financial compensation to play, so they weren't paid to play their sports because they had high societal position, they were wealthy, they didn't need any more money to do their sports, they had the time, so they were the amateurs, but obviously gentlemen because they were higher in the society. Playing professionals were opposite the lower class, were at lower societal positions, and they needed their financial compensation. Now, they got that through broken time payments, and this is where payments were made if a player was needed compensation for loss of their wages. They couldn't work because they were playing for their sports. They took time off to play their sports. Okay, so and this money came from benefactors, so usually rich team owners, the sports clubs themselves who had a lot of money, or factory team owners, the factory teams, the factory owners. So they were taking their time out of their work to play for these teams, and this was the beginning and the early stages of professionalism. So this is the introduction you talk about, is the early steps of commercialization, and it happened around about the Industrial Revolution. So be careful of that, and it was pointed out by one of the examiner's reports. So if we start at the impact of the commercial impact of the Olympic Games, the examiner report also mentions that it's best to break your questions down in earliest point and move your way up historically. So obviously you'll start with the Industrial Revolution, we sort of talked about that and those key terms, but then you might want to talk about the Olympics and the order that they go in. Generally, the exam question could be broken down into a specific, what were the impacts of the Olympic Games on commercialization? It could say what were the impacts of individual dates on commercialization, or they might say what are the major events of the Olympics that influenced the Los Angeles Games. So you just got to be careful on that. Or you could bring it into your 15 marker and just show your general understanding of the historical development of the Olympic Games. So we might start with Mexico City. Now, we don't really have a huge amount of impact on commercialization here, but you do need to know some of the key things. So we had the Black Power salute with Smith and Carlos. You have the student massacre, where students were protesting about the cost of the Olympics, the cost of running the Olympics, and basically were massacred. They were gunned down by the government in a big cover-up. Now, then you go to Munich, which is the next Olympics, which was where we had quite low security, or very low security, and it led to an opportunity being taken, and there was a Palestinian terrorist attack on Israeli athletes. And I'm sure you've been taught about this already. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. Now, the knock-on effect on that was that the Montreal Games, the next games on, were quite panicky about the security, quite rightly. So they increased their security. They had more security members of staff than the athletes. So they overpaid on security. They also were building new facilities while the country wasn't in a great state anyway. So they ended up bankrupting themselves, and it was a financial disaster. Now the example sort of ask you then to know about the 84. There was a 1980 Games, which was in Moscow, but you don't need to know about that for the for this question. Then basically no one bid for the next Olympic Games, in the bidding rights. The only country that did was America and Los Angeles. Now they got the rights by default in 1984, but the key things that you need to know is that because of the financial disaster of Montreal, the US government and LA state refused to fund the games. So what they had to do, the Olympic Organizing Committee at that time, they basically hired a man called Peter Ueberroth to create a business model to fund the Olympics. So first thing he did was he sold the TV rights, he sold the Olympic festoon, which is the logo of the rings. He created a blueprint that is then used for future commercial games, a blueprint for commercialization, which involved sponsorship and advertising, and it was a games that turned a profit, and the blueprint is used now to build profit in World Games. This led to the top sponsorship program, which stands for the Olympic Partner Program, and it's basically key sponsors, not little sponsors, very big key sponsors put lots of money into the Olympics, and it's like an exclusivity rights that they have to use the festoon and advertise at the Olympic Games. So if we were talking about a slightly tangent and a slightly separate question, we say, well, what did these games impacted these games have on the 1984 games? So basically, the 1968 games, if you focus on the Black Power salute, which is to emphasize the plight of black and ethnic athletes, or the treatment of black people in America and ethnic minorities, and this led to more of a societal acceptance of black athletes in the Olympic Games in 1984. The Munich disaster improved the security of the 1984 Games, but also the political. They put a statement out saying the Olympic Games are still free from political involvement, which we should have looked at. The part of your revision is the Olympics and their values, and are they still valued today, which is linked to that free from politics. And then finally, like we just talked about, the Montreal Games, how their financial disaster impacted the Los Angeles Games. So another question, an often 15-mark question, is analyze or discuss the influence of commercialization to global sport or to society. Now, this is a key thing, is to look at the word evaluate or analyze or discuss. And when you're doing that, you need to be looking at the positive sides of it and the negative sides of it. And then obviously a 15 marker, you want to set the scene where you can start bringing in the impacts of the Industrial Revolution and then the Olympic Games, and then start talking about the positives and negatives. So if we start with the positives, try to break it down into sort of a theme for you. So as a sort of spectator, you can talk about that there's higher levels of performance, but that could also link to performers. But generally, we used to get high levels of performance, and you'll get a vast range of media coverage. And we're not just talking about TV, but you've got lots of media sources: TV, internet, social media, newsprint, radio. Lots of media opportunities. Then you've got the increase in viewer knowledge. Sorry, I've got a doubled up there, and I don't know why there is. Now, because of the depth of coverage and the way the broadcasting works, you get a lot more analysis on TV, and then viewers have a greater depth of knowledge, and because of the greater depth of coverage. And this is generally down to the fact that TV provides an all year round opportunity to watch sport. Now that's sort of like as a spectator and as a viewer. Now if we talked about the actual spectators while they're live at the events, you've got an improved safety for the spectators. So the stadiums are much better equipped, and there's better facilities at the stadium, which is linked to that. You've got improved sort of the Americanization of sport, so the whole package, the razzmatazz of sport, the excitement, the entertainment, it's really put together for the fans, for the spectators, because the more people go, the more people watch, we get more involvement in that golden triangle, and more investment in the sport because of the advertising rights and things like that. Now if we look at in terms of the impact on sports, you get an improved opportunities for minority sports, and it's often down to TV as well, because the minority sports are getting the coverage because of the amount of TV coverage. You get more labour migration, and that gives more opportunities and career development for individuals who can get more money and get escapism. So you can look at the benefits and the positives of labour migration and link that into how that links to commercialisation. And then there's an increased opportunities for female sports and disabled sports, and you could bring in the words role models in that question as well. So there's a massive increase in opportunities for people from the less mainstream sports. And then in general, players get better facilities, the sports get better facilities, which means that ultimately their performance levels are going to increase as well. And there's that knock-on effect on the golden triangle. Now, as a player, you're going to increase, and this is linked to the labour migration and stuff like that, you get players become global superstars, they get higher wages, there's more opportunities for them. And because of this and the involvement in business, there's a more legal aspect where performers' rights are upheld, looking at agents and what the agents do. And there's the Bosman ruling. If you've been taught about the Bosman ruling, if you haven't, it's basically the rule that allows footballers to leave their clubs at the end of their contract, whereas before they weren't allowed to leave their clubs. And it was a legal battle by a player called Bosman, and he was allowed to leave at the end of his contracts. So that's improving the rights of the performers. It also, the golden triangle, the media, that side of it allows players to have longer careers. The money gets invested back into the players and they can play for a lot longer. But also there's players playing future careers, so it could link into a development of coaching or punditry, and those opportunities for those players after they finish their careers. Back to sort of like the development of sport, grassroots gets the investment from the money, comes back down to grassroots, so there's higher participation rates at them, and increasing mass participation, which has a knock-on effect, more at the base, and that participation period means there's going to be more reaching the elite and therefore more medals. Funding allows the sport to be run in a more professional manner, so it's run as a business and managed more accurately and in a more, like I say, professionally. And it also allows the funding from the Golden Triangle allows athletes to become full-time athletes, particularly in sports like athletics and stuff like that. Swimming, where athletes traditionally don't make a lot of money from the gate receipts, but they can get funding from the governing bodies, who are in turn getting their money back from the Golden Triangle. So, it allows athletes to work full-time as an athlete, and therefore opportunities to win more medals. Now, the Golden Triangle is proven successful model. There's no doubt about it. And then the mass business that surrounds sport is testament to it. So it's not just the players on the field. There's so many business opportunities around sport that are linked to that Golden Triangle, and you could probably put any sort of career and link sport to it. So sports journalism, sports media, sports broadcasting, sports nutrition, sports science. There's loads of things around it that the Golden Triangle's allowed that career to develop. So all these huge positives, now they affect society, but they also affect the global aspects. So don't be torn into just talking about the UK benefits. It's worldwide, global benefits. So finally, we go into the negatives of commercialism and commercialization. They mean the same thing. Now, keywords there, and I think I've made another video up on some of these keywords prior to this, so do check it out. But players are treated as a commodity. Now, commodity is where they are bought and sold and treated as something that has value, not as an individual. So players are treated like that commodity. In sports like baseball, for example, they're traded without any discussion of the players. They're just moved around. But players are pawns in a game, and a bigger game, so it's definitely negative sometimes to the players when they're treated like exploited, for example, as something that adds value to the club. I think exploitation can happen in commercialization because they are seen as value to the club, and this can also be child exploitation. And some youth who are seen as talented can be exploited and made to work, pushed harder, and so on and so forth. There is knock-on effects of transfer fees. There's a negative impact of there's more money in sports. So once one player gets valued at one money, then more money, and then it goes up, and the money goes up, and the transfer fees rise. So that's definitely a negative aspect that they're becoming out of hand. And then players don't necessarily have a loyalty to the team. If they're treated as commodity, they don't have a loyalty to the team, and they follow the money, because we said about those high wages, and we've seen it now. A lot of players heading off to Saudi Arabia for football. Is there any loyalty, or are they just following the money, the mercenary effect? Players are also pushed, because they're seen as commodity, pushed and really hard, and there's a high demand on the players, so there's higher injury rates or burnout rates where they just get exhausted and unable to play. And again, I suppose this inflated wages makes smaller teams unable to compete with bigger teams, because the commercialization is affecting the huge teams, and the smaller clubs can't afford to pay the same wages. So you have the dominance of the large clubs due to the inflated wages. Now, generally, this is sort of like how sport is, and how the sort of sport is affected. So that was all about the players, and this is now more about the sports. Football just dominates in commercialization. It's the biggest sport in the world, so it generally dominates, and the media tends to focus on those already popular sports. So the minority sports are at a disadvantage to those popular sports, rugby, football, cricket. They get the money, they get the media focus, they get more and more sponsorship as a result of that. But that also drives up the costs of live sport. The ticket prices to go to see live sport is some clubs, it's ridiculously expensive, and that then limits people. So you tend to have like a middle class fan base who go to the live games in the stadia because they can afford it, whereas the lower people with lower socioeconomical backgrounds aren't able to go to live games as much. You could also bring in at this point, the negatives that are linked to labour migration, i.e. that, it takes away positions from homegrown talent. And you could just list off a load more, like plastic Brits and things like that impacts the negatives of labour migration. Just check, there's another video on that you can watch. Now, labour migration Yeah, so just watch that extra video on labour migration. Now, the TV and the media can be a negative. So there is a saturation of TV, sport on TV. You know, there's so much sport on TV, and what that can do is water down and dilute the importance of that sporting event. So, you know, you can turn a channel on and there's just too much sport on TV. Then media can sensationalize stories, so they can make heroes and villains out of the players and the coaches, and they can influence whether a coach is hired or fired, or a players, you know, are victimized and made the villain of the story and then pushed out of a club. And generally, I'm sure you already know the impacts of TV dictating the timings of events. They can dictate elements to national governing bodies because they invest so much money in them. They have a lot of control and say over the actual organisation of sport in general. Now, there is a reliance of the money that TV generates, and if that TV money disappeared, some sports would fold. They wouldn't be able to compete. So, you know, some sports do heavily rely on that for money, and if it goes, that's a negative. And then also you've got this demands of players and coaches, and there's those appearance fees and the interviews they have to make, and you know, it puts added pressure on the players, added pressure on the account managers and the coaches, that it can be seen as negative. Now, in general, there's this sort of link to deviance, and I'd always talk about deviance and how it's increased because of commercialisation. There's increased instances of gamesmanship, increased instances of performance-enhancing drugs because of the pressures to win. You know, winning means there's more contracts, and link it back to that golden triangle and how sport influences the sponsors and the business and media. And they're linked to their lucrative contracts. You know, there's a pressure to maintain those contracts and the lifestyles that players have. So they might turn to deviance and gamesmanship to ensure that because of the pressure. You know, and there's that win at all costs idea that's linked to Americanization of sport, which is again linked to that commercialization. Now, the final points you could be talking about is the sort of like the world games, the concepts of world games and the Olympics. Now, those sort of world games, the Commonwealth Games, the world games, are now becoming so costly to run because of this media hype, the Americanization, the overhypeness of it. It becomes beyond most cities' ability to pay for the games. So and I think a good example is the Australia unable to host the Commonwealth Games, and they had to, you know, sacrifice those Commonwealth Games because it was too expensive to run, and they were afraid of, you know, going back down to the Montreal, you know, financial disasters. So it could be a negative, and then there is, you know, if it does work out, and we go back to the Montreal, the LA Games and the potential profit to be made at those World Games because of the commercialization and the profit that can be made. There's also links to bribery and you know, the World Cup, as the accusation that the World Cup was given to Qatar and things like that. And there's links to bribery and the scandals that are associated with it. You know, that comes down to national governing bodies and international governing bodies awarding games necessarily to the right people. So that's linked in as a negative of commercialization. So lots to consider. Definitely potentially a 15-mark exam question where you start with saying what is commercialization, what is the golden triangle, what are these key terms, commodities, what's the sort of historical aspects of the Industrial Revolution followed by the Olympic Games. Then you can start talking about the positive aspects of commercialization, and then you can start looking at the negatives aspects of commercialization, finishing off with probably like a conclusion where you reach a conclusion, you make a judgment of whether you think it's good or bad, and there's no right or wrong answer. It's just finishing your thought process and combining it. Do plan these questions out. It is prime for a 15-mark exam question. Revise it as a 15-mark exam question, because then if it comes up as a lower mark question, an 8-mark question for example, you're going to be in a good position. It might just be an 8-mark question on the positives or 8-mark question on the negatives, or it might be an 8-mark question section on just the Olympics influence. So big area to revise, very likely to come up in your exams, so do revise it, and good luck.